where we left off, historically speaking, right? We have the Jews returning from, or the Israelites have returned from exile, right? And are now living in Yehud, right? Which is a Persian province, right? The Persians are technically in charge. They've set up kind of little puppet governments to make sure that, these governors and whatnot will kind of keep things in order as the Persians would want them to be in order. And as we kind of saw, Zerubbabel and Joshua come on the scene as the governor and the priest, but all those messianic hopes and all those hopes for this huge restoration of Israel end up falling through, right? Israel does not become its own independent state. You have Zerubbabel, who is this king from a Davidic lineage, but he's not this full autonomous king, right? He's not leading. He never leads Israel or Yehud now into this kind of promised, day of the Lord that everybody was looking forward to. And because of this, right, Israel is now, and the Israelites are now in this very interesting place. And I think that the sentiments that Langston Hughes expressed in his poem Harlem really are applicable to what the Israelites would have been feeling during this time, right? This is the poem he wrote. He says, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" Right? Think about the dream of the Israelites, this dream for this messianic king, this figure to really vindicate Israel, this dream for an independent land that is ruled by Israel, right? All of these dreams, this dream for this glorious temple, right? All of these dreams get kind of deferred. And remember, we talked a little bit about one of these responses is this eschatological hope, right? Rather than restoration being at a point on a timeline, it's the point at the very end of the timeline, right? So these hopes are no longer a point in history, but at the end of history. Another response that we see is wrapped up in the writings, right? Which is the last section of the Hebrew Bible, right? We've gone through the Torah, we've gone through the Nevi'im, and now we are at the Ketuvim, right? The writings. So let's think about those questions that you had to start off with, right? These two difficult realities. They're now spread throughout the region, and they're under Persian rule. What are some of the things you guys came up with as you discussed why these two things are actual difficulties?
We talked about over here about the Persian rule, having maybe two different religious beliefs, having fear of persecution if it's different than Persian. So if they're what was it talking about, like the holy, if they were the chosen people, then they wouldn't want foreign nations and they stuff.
That's fair. What we need to kind of remember, though, looking at the Persian rule, is remember that it's Cyrus the Great who actually gives them money to restart their whole religious cult, right? And so the Persians have a very hands-off kind of approach to Israelite religion. They say, this is almost like kind of a rule by appeasement, right? You do what you want to do. You're not going to think that we're oppressive. We're going to support your religious cult, this kind of thing. And so there's not that much of a stress, but I think maybe, along the lines of what we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah, this like struggling for, this religious ethnic identity, we can definitely talk about for sure.
And it was probably, I don't know how to, maybe kind of shaking their faith because the Davidic line wasn't fully
right.
Davidic line, am I saying it right?
For sure, yeah.
Wasn't fully restored.
That whole hope for Davidic dynasty, the DH kind of leads up to and says, this is it. Right now, that seems to just be, like, that's, what happens to that dream deferred?
Yeah.
Right, what do we do with that? Good. What about the first one, being spread out? Why is that a difficulty?
Decentralized worship.
Yeah, for sure. Decentralized worship, right? The temple is no longer central, right? Do we still say that these Israelites that are still in Babylon are true Israelites? How do you continue to worship when you are separated from that? What do we focus on if we're not focusing on temple life?
Yes, that was when they were still, the ones who were still there, when they had come back, when the people who had come back from exile, they were, faced with, excuse me, them wanting to divorce their foreign wives. So, you know, it was like, well, you coming back, but you're telling us we've not had these wives. I mean, the choice of choosing Israelite wives, so we took the foreign wives.
Right.
Want to maybe, you know, start maybe purifying the race again.
All right, so again, those ethnic tensions kind of coming to the fore. Good. So we can see how the Israelites, even though they are being allowed to be back in, you know, quote unquote, the promised land, and aren't, you know, in exile anymore, are having money flow into their society, the rebuilding of the temple and the reestablishment of the cult. Even despite all these good things, there's still these these very real difficulties and these struggles for the people as far as imagining, okay, what does Israelite faith look like now? How do we continue as a people? Where do we place emphasis? What does this look like now? And what we see during this time, we talked about, because of this decentralized worship, what were some of the things that we said started becoming more prevalent in Israelite society and cultic life instead of temple worship?
Oh, the things like the circumcision, the things they could do outside the central
Right.
worship.
Right, circumcision,
Mobile presence.
diet,
Sabbath.
Sabbath, good. Right, another thing that we need to add to this list are texts. Texts become very central. It's during the exile and the return from the exile that a lot of these stories and these books take their final shape. Right? That these books actually start taking form. That these stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob get put down on paper. Right? Because no longer do we have this stable community that can just tell these stories over and over in kind of an oral way. Now we are in diaspora, right? We have this community that's very spread out, so we need to write these stories down. Right? We need to write these stories down so that the Jews in diaspora can be sharing the same stories that we here in Jerusalem are sharing. Right?
The stories of Abraham and everything, they weren't written down until now?
No, I mean, they may have been written down, but as far as taking the final shape of the books that we kind of now have them in, as far as, you know, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, like all of that.
Canon?
Yeah.
They developed it like
The canon starts to form here,
Okay.
right? But the canon, remember, is made up of smaller books, right? So even those books start to get finalized during the exilic and post-exilic time. All right, so there's this huge importance on text. Now, even though a lot of these texts are being agreed upon by the community, the interpretation of those texts is not. Okay, and this was one of the questions that kind of, I think, tripped a lot of you up on the quiz, is that what we see in the writings that come out of this period is this very different kind of interpretation of what all of this means, right? Are very different responses to these realities. Okay, so we can, when we look at the writings, these are mostly written between the 6th and the 2nd centuries. Okay. And like I said, a lot of these probably contain works and songs and things like that that have been around for a long time, right? But this is when they start to get collected, right? Just like the Torah and the Nevi'im here. And within the Ketuvim, we have lots of different genres, right? So, for example, you know, when we looked at the Torah and the Nevi'im, we see some different kind of forms within these books, but for the most part, these take very similar shapes to one another, right? The prophetic books look very similar to one another. With the Ketuvim, however, we have a lot of different kind of forms. What would be some forms or genres that you would expect to find here in the writings?
Poetry.
What's that?
Poetry.
Poetry, good. Particularly where?
Songs.
Good. What else would we find?
Theological histories,
Such as what?
reinterpreting Israel's past, first and Second Chronicles.
Good. Right. So we have these theological histories, right? Such as in First and Second Chronicles. Laments, right? And this is going to be kind of a subset of poetry, right? But also we see a whole book of this with Lamentations, right? Lament is a form of Hebrew poetry that we see. Good. What else?
Practical and speculative wisdom.
Okay, somebody's got their book open. Right. We have what's called the wisdom tradition, right? Particularly with what we see in Proverbs. Okay. We also have things like folk tales, like we see in the book of Job, right, and so on. Right. These are going to be some of the forms that we'll see in the Ketuvim, right, in the writings that we're going to go through. Now, remember when I said that in the Ketuvim, in the writings, we have this diversity of opinion, right? This diversity of perspective on religious life during this period. And a really great place that we see this is in the book of Psalms itself.